Yeah, you're welcome to this very lesson, a continuation of the first part of our relationship with post-structuralism, and a very interesting topic we are taking at the moment. Now, we told us the last time we met that post-structuralism is a form of critical concept, theoretical, different from structuralism. We may call it, if we will, if we want to use the word theory, we may call it a loose theory of several components, a loose theory of how to look at the heterogeneity of cultural productions like the literary text, music, graphic arts. And then we can also say that it is a way of bringing about a form of heterogeneity of many issues that might be related to what we call tradition or history or knowledge itself or philosophy or whatever thing that seems to accrue to a structuration, something that is almost already known by any society, anybody, a kind of sign that creates around itself a concept or a legality of stability. Now, post-structuralism itself, we may say, is not a thesis that announces the fall of structure, that is the end of structure. Rather, we may say that post-structuralism is a way of identifying structural mutations, structural plays. By extension, it recognizes structure, but in its apartness, in the way in which it can always be reconstituted or reformulated or even differentiated from itself. Now, in the context of post-structuralism, we'll find out that there have been several, ways by which critics, intellectuals, practitioners of phenomena like politics, like art itself, and then history would like to see that there are ways in which we may observe what had been given as having another part of itself, having alternatives of itself. And therefore, the context of the post-structuralist coming into literature is to look at the unacceptability, the impossibility of stability of science. Now, we told us that post-structuralism began as a query of the fixity that structuralism presents. Fixities like, when you are talking about, let's come to literature now. When we are talking about a literary text, to make meaning out of it is to establish the idea that there is an embedded structuration within that text. By extension, the way in which you can recognize a particular text, for instance, is to recognize one, maybe the genre of that text. And the moment you are able to understand the genre of that text, the structuralist will be trying to affirm certain ways in which it becomes that genre, some assume specificities of that genre. And therefore, you can say that this is prose fiction and all that. Now, if you also want to look at the subject matter, what you are really dealing with in that particular text, all you have to do is to read or to observe what you are looking at and then form, you connote the meaning of what you are looking at within a fixed situation. Now, connotation is not proper when we are talking about structuralism. But then the structuralists will want to take the idea of identifying something specific and then making it a globalized thing, something that is universalized, something that Jacques Derrida would call a transcendentally signified. Now, when a structuralist is talking about meaning, what the structuralist is trying to identify is what Ferdinand de Saussure had seen as the difference between the langue and the parole. The langue being the systemic, the architecture, the cartography, the map of the linguistic sign as a fixed compartment by which you can talk about a knowable relationship between the signifier and the signified. We've talked about this some time back. And then the signifier having to mean the phonic abstraction of what that thing is referring to in the conceptualized sense, which is the signified. So that when you use the word cool, you are having something that that language society refers to as a phenomenon of maybe the weather or temperature, which is definitely not the same as it's different, like warm or hot. And therefore, within that context, Saussure began to look at a stability, a unity, okay, of meaning, which can be recognized by how language plays within the language system. And then along that line, he looks at the difference between the langue as a systemic unit of how language relates, that from the parole, which is the way in which that element of the knowledge of that language are used in communication, in the media, in talking about what individual language projectors, that is speakers, mean when they are really using the language. But then for the structuralists, you discover that every element of meaning is invested in that literary compact, that what we call literature. Okay. And then within that kind of situation, you derive knowable meanings because of the relationship of this element of language with that other element of language, which a language community, like for example, the Anglophone community, will recognize as that. And by extension, the relationship of the signifier and the signified is therefore arbitrary. By extension, the relationship of the signifier and the sign in any context of communication is always stabilized. That is the assumption of the structuralist. But then when we come to the domain of the post-structuralist, we see that the sign itself is problematic when we begin to talk about its unity in the context of how the structuralist puts it, that within every form of structure, there are a number of differential relations which even supersede what the structuralist is saying. Now, let's come back to the key proponents that we'll be looking at in this lecture in relation to post-structuralism. Now, post-structuralism itself, interestingly, okay, was developed within a social context where intellectuals, to a very great extent, were having a problem with how society was working and how things were put across within institutions. Institutions of politics, of the academia, of literature, and of a number of relations within society. And within that context, it was a very interesting moment right from the late 1950s to the early 1980s. So that we discover that a number of these leftist, critics who are in France were actually engaging a number of phenomena that were constituted as already known within the society. Some of these people included people like Roland Barthes himself, people like Jacques Lacan, who is more known within the field of psychoanalysis, people like Jacques Derrida, definitely, and a man called Philip Sollers. Sollers happened to be one of the co-publishers, in fact, the main publisher, so to speak, of an academic journal, you may call it magazine, called Telquel. Telquel was established in 1960 and it went on till the early 1980s in France. Telquel started out as a journal that was investigating the concept of meaning as something that is stabilized, something that is unified, something that can easily be tracked, and something that can always be seen as self-present within society. So within Telkel, these critics began to formulate their post-structuralist ideas, and within that particular journal, we discover that the very roots of theorizing of the text, things like the text, things like the death of the author, we're coming to that Roland Barthes began to talk about, and then the idea of deconstruction came about. Now, we are taking about 3 scholars of note in explicating what we are referring to in post-structuralism. I'll start with Roland Barthes. Now, Roland Barthes is very much known as the key formulator of the concept of the death of the author and, of course, of the pleasure of the text. Let me start with his idea of the text. The text was not something that was formulated by Roland Barthes. And the post-structuralist dimensions of looking at the text was not just consigned to Barthes himself. Barthes was a post-structuralist a projector of discourses that were coming as oppositional to the emetic construct of structuralism, which needed to be dissembled. Now, for Roland Barthes, the idea of the work as a unified material thing that we refer to as literature, which can be handled, which can be put on shelves, or which can be attributed to a particular origin, begins to get ruptured with the coming in, the replacement of work with text. What does Roland Barthes mean? Now, by work is meant a kind of production, a kind of position, a kind of projection that is aligned with a system of writing that can be located to a particular origin, a particular author, and which in itself is compacted, is homogeneous, and is different from other kind of work. For example, if I were to pick up a William Shakespeare text, I'm looking at Othello, for example. I might be saying, in the structuralist sense of the work, that Othello is a work of William Shakespeare that is in its semantic subject matter derivation is different from a work like The Tempest, which the same author wrote. By extension, to talk about a work is to talk about a unity of the sign, a unity of meaning, a unity of a particular subject matter and the connected thematics that are wrapped up within it, so that the work has a kind of reference to a particular source which is absolutely transcendent, which is absolutely something or someone you refer to as the source, and to a very great extent which also dictates the meanings within it. But then when we come to the realm of the text, in the time that Roland Barthes and, of course, the post-structuralists began to observe it, were actually projected in a very, very resounding manner by Roland Barthes by talking about the pleasure of the text. The text now talks about not just a product, which is the work, it's now talking about productivity, an internal play of meanings that bring the text, that brings what you are interacting with as literature, as having several ways of interpreting it. And then when we talk about the text, therefore, we are talking about something that moves from the work, okay, to a signifying practice, which allows individual readers to make their own meanings, to make an heterogeneity of meanings out of the same text based on their own biases, their own histories, their own locations in society, in backgrounds like families, in their relationship with text, with time, with history, and a number of things like that. So that the text itself becomes a very, very fluid thing. That is, when I pick up William Shakespeare's Othello, I'm no more reading what perhaps I might be referring to as the meaning within William Shakespeare. We might be, while we are looking at the meaning within Othello, now, while we might be talking about certain main context of themes that's common within Othello, as a work, as a text, Othello is opened up to several significations. For example, it could be talking about the moment of racial difference and the conflict of racial ideas. We could be talking about the element of masculinity, okay, which plays in differences. For example, we can be talking about the reign of a systemic of hegemonic masculinity as against what you might call a marginalized masculinity, represented in the character of Othello and people of his ilk. We might be talking about, how Othello itself grounds a discourse of patriarchal reading. In other words, we might be, by extension, looking at how the female body is to a very large extent absent or, postponed within the very text. We might also be interested in the language of Othello. For example, if somebody is coming from a formalist perspective of reading Othello, that person is likely going to be commenting about the poetry, the language used that Shakespeare brings, the metaphorizations that come in, and the actual ways in which shock comes in within play with Othello. So that textuality in the context of the post-structuralist is not about the production of a particular work. It is actually about the productivity of that work. That is, the embedded meanings, the several levels of meanings you can find within Othello. Now, within post-structuralist thought, there is a movement from what we may call signification to signifying practices. Roland Barthes actually talks about the certain concepts which he puts across in French. For example, he talks about the text as a network of play, that is semantic plays. When you are playing in literal social terms, you are not actually serious. I don't mean you are not responsible or your brain is not working. We mean that when we are playing, we are not taking things very fixed. It is a time to unwind oneself. It is a time to, differ from what is always regimented, what is always the norm. You are doing a kind of, self-reflection when you are playing. And then when Roland Barthes now talks about, textual play, as you refer to it, is moving away from signification, which is a fixed correspondence between the signifier and the signified, to the play of the signifiers that definitely also makes the signified at certain point another level of a signifier, another level where it becomes a signifier itself. For example, when the meaning, of a particular text might be that it's talking about a culture. For example, let's come back to Chinua Achebe again. If you are talking about what the text achieves as work in Chinua Achebe, as talking about the knowability of a pre-colonial Igbo world and the way they relate, in the way in which, culture and relationships are brought about, and how this align to the way they see the world, the characters there see the world, you can move it in a post-structuralist sense and take that, what you have taken as the meaning, that is how to understand a pre-colonial Igbo world. You can take it from a post-structuralist sense, and that thing which you have called, the pre-Igbo world can be elevated in a post-structuralist sense, and it becomes a signifier of another signified, which might be a masculinized society of a colonial context within an African space. If you take it beyond that and you want to look at another meaning there, you might also be looking at how the humanity of the male people, the male characters, is not uniform. You might be looking at people that are hegemonic, people like Okonkwo, the high priest, and the big people within the society of Umofia, how those males are vastly different from marginalized or failed males within that social structure, like Okonkwo's father or his son, whom Okonkwo always looks down on. So that post-structuralism allows us to look at the text as very, 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 embedded in its heterogeneity, in a way in which it can produce several kinds of meanings. Now, if we look at that, Barthes talks about, he uses a language which we call signifiance. That is a French word. Signifiance has been explained by some, post-structuralists, people like Robert Young, for example, and some other post-structuralists as not having a very coherent English meaning that we can easily track, but we can have something close to it. For example, it has an idea of ecstasy, an ecstatic play, okay, in which it forever is playing around with meanings. And it also have this connotation with sexual ecstasy, climax, so to speak, in which there is no possibility of having a knowable meaning of that text. In other words, the text is open to several fields that its readers or its observers might be coming from and therefore making their meanings from it, which makes that text something of a textual in the sense of open-ended form. Now, the form is not something that has in a particular geography, that has a particular boundary. It is a kind of form of, fluidity, a form that is liquid, not of a solid form. We can talk about forms broadly. You can say, oh, this is the form of the book in material terms. It is rectangular, it is this, it is that. But how can you actually talk about the form of the sea? Even though it has a form, we can talk about the sea, but you can't say the shores are its boundary because you're only seeing the shores that are close to you when you are viewing it. But have you seen the shores that go further and further into the depth of the sea down there? You can't. So all you can say is that the sea has a fluid form and you never really know where it ends, something like that. So post-structuralism is a way in which there is this ecstatic, fluid ways by which meanings can be derived, meanings can be tracked, and meanings can be brought about. Now, another word that Roland Barthes uses is the word jouissance. Jouissance has to do with pleasure, has to do with play. Jouissance is a form in which one is even lost to oneself in the context of play. So that play becomes a way in which the texts of cultural products like literature, of music, okay, of the graphic arts, of dance, of film, okay, and so many other things can be brought into several ways in which knowledge can navigate within them. Now, let's go to another thing Roland Barthes brings about in the course of his post-structuralist thoughts. The thoughts of what he describes as the death of the author. In other words, the fact that the author, so to speak, the human writer, the human producer of a literary work is dead. Now, what does that mean? Let us start by talking about this, that Roland Barthes' conceptualization of the death of the author was not unique to him in its originary context. This is what I mean. Roland Barthes was not the first person that brought about an idea of how the author is not very significant to meaning making of a text. Let me hazard and tell us that the idea of the non importance of the author as the meaning maker of a text had preceded Roland Barthes. It's as far back as the times of the formalists and the structuralists. Remember, in Russian formalism, there is no place for the author at all. Ideas of the new critics of the Anglo-American formalists, you don't find the author there as ever necessary. The only place where the author is referred to, we may assert, as well part of the making of the text, but not actually the sole producer, is in the formalist conception of T.S. Eliot. We're talking about his idea of tradition and how tradition, literary tradition, goes beyond what the author is producing. In that relation, we can say that T.S. Eliot was foregrounding the fact that Roland Barthes actually began to put in a more elaborate theorizing. In T.S. Eliot's tradition, okay, I just call it tradition, he was relating it to the production of literature and all that, okay, he was actually talking about how the author is a conduit of some traditions of writing, canonical traditions of writing that the author inescapably fuses into and continues. By extension, there is nothing innovative about the author here. The author is just like a conduit of what he or she had inherited from the aesthetic practices of previous canonical authors that he or she continues. By extension, we can argue that this kind of argumentation of the author had already preceded Roland Barthes' conceptualization of the death of the author. But let me just put it this way a little bit more, that in formalism and structuralism, the author is not present at all. The author is not existent. Let's put it that way. The idea is just that the author is not in this, the society is not in this, history doesn't formulate. We are just looking at the form itself. But in the formulation of Roland Barthes, the death of the author, one way or the other, is interestingly, now I'm deploying a deconstructive means of even looking at his own death of the author. By talking about the death of the author, is to agree that the author had been living. And when people die, they don't actually always die. They don't die forever. They don't go extinct. This is what I'm trying to say. If somebody lost a dear relative and the person is no more, the person is simply absent from within the material terrain of relationship. But the dead can even be more present in the memory of the relative, which means that the author in this context that Roland Barthes puts it is deferred. The author does not constitute the main voice of the text. The author is just, if you like, a palimpsestual. Now, palimpsest is a word used to talk about attachments of a number of things. The author is just a palimpsestual signature that is not the main reference or the foundation of the meaning, but the author is just a kind of patched thing that is within the whole fabric of knowledge production about the text. By extension, the author ceases to be the main creator of meaning. The author is not what the person you refer to, is rather a deferred element of the meaning making mechanism of the text. By extension, when we talk about the death of the author in the context that Roland Barthes deploys it, is talking about one, the erasure of the author. But remember, everything we erase always have their traces. They might not be very visible, but the slate or the sheet you have just erased something from is marked, and it has something unique to the fact that there had been a present which is now absent. So the author, the significance of Roland Barthes' discussion about the death of the author is not referring actually to the idea that the author is not recognized within the text itself. It's just that the author's voice is silent for the productivity of more important or equally important voices that make up the several meanings of the text. Therefore, we can say that even in post-structuralism, there is the allowance of the fact that the author has a meaning. It's just that there is no hegemonic meaning that the author can derive for us. The author can as well not be referred to. Why are we talking about Roland Barthes? Why do we talk about Jacques Derrida? Why do we talk about what they wrote concerning post-structuralism? Because they are very important when we idealize how this concept began to come up. But then, like Derrida began to talk about later, Derrida began to talk about what he calls deconstruction. And listen to this very interesting analysis. When Derrida talks about deconstruction, it's referring to, initially, he takes up Ferdinand de Saussure and begins to say that, so to speak, ironically, the structuralists, theorizing present something logocentric. When he talks about something logocentric, he's not even saying that Ferdinand de Saussure began the moment of logocentrism, but that Saussure inescapably is trapped within the very context, the ideas of presence, the idea of fixities, the idea of tradition, the idea of the idea of literature or the idea of form that had been there right from classical times within the West. That gives a way of having stabilized meanings about society, about culture, about institutions, about meaning, about tradition, about histories, and so many other things like that. So for Jacques Derrida, the logocentric thought is embedded within structuralism, and that is why structuralism is so compacted to tell you if it is not this, then it's different is this. Ironically, Derrida plays with the idea of the difference making of structuralism and says that inescapably, Ferdinand de Saussure actually grounds what he calls différance. Différance. But I'll come to that later. Let's talk about the logos in logocentrism. Logocentrism is a way of talking about a mechanism that has its own boundaries, its own knowability, and which transcends any competing voice about it. In other words, logocentrism is a form of metaphysics. And when we talk about metaphysics, we are talking about systems or patterns that give us knowable things that are taken as given, that have their elements of causality, their embeddedness of truth, their ideas of rationality, which you can't break, which becomes totalizing, transcendentalist, to use Derrida's terminology, that become transcendentally signified. For example, if you talked about literature, and which is still going on in our present society, if people talk about literature very, very, liberally, they are referring to work. They are referring to something that is published, something that must be written, something mostly known through a Western language like English, French, and all that. If it's not translated, it seems that there are certain organizers in the West. There is a kind of technology of literariness in the West that must pass through apparatuses of the audience, the late capitalist system of publications, okay, agencies, okay, prize systems like the Nobel Prize, Kane Prize, Booker Prize, to authorize that thing as literature. Now, have you ever observed that most of those prize winners have always been recognized in their written productivities? Rarely ever in their oral production or as film, producers and all that. But a difference came not quite long. We began to see somebody like Bob Dylan being recognized as a Nobel laureate. Dylan actually happens to be a musician. If you are in the United States, he is a known person associated with music rather than something written. But then what we are bringing out is that when that happened, it became a talk of the globe that how could you bring a musician to be a Nobel laureate, for goodness sake, of literature? When you have this name, that and I really I also felt like that at that point. What when you have this one, that one, this big name, that big name that been writing forever, okay, why couldn't you pick this? Who knows this man? Well, that is not the business here. The idea was looking at certain signifying things that brought him out as a literary producer. For example, the stories of some of his lyrics, the poetry of some of his lyrics, the way they were contagious, probably referred back to how literature was known in classical to Western times, where music and drama, a play were embedded in what was called literature. So if we did this, we are actually trying to say that literature becomes something very open-ended. Now, the logos there, when Derrida talk about logocentrism, logos, which is the root morpheme, the root word in the root morpheme within logocentrism, is literally, we can call it speech, literally speech. In other words, logos has to do with spoken language, and spoken language as a way of presence in communication, in communicative practice. For example, if you are talking to people in society, that's the assumption, the presence of what you are saying is fabricated through the fact that you are exchanging in words. The language of the word, or the medium of the word rather, okay, becomes a presence that captures the dialogue and that makes relationship to flow. Now, logos also transcends that initial, relationship of presence to something of revelation, something of celestial endorsement, because the logos also refers to the Greek reference to the word as a revelation, the word as of scripture that has reference to the Bible. And by extension, when we talk about something logocentric, we are talking about something that has an immediate encapsulating, self-presence with an authority that has its own supreme meaning. All forms of institutional practices in the West and ways in which even modernism began to come up to become a transcendental signifier of progress in the current world today came up through this mechanism of this rationale of the logocentric. So when we talk about something being logocentric in Derrida's term, logocentrism is a way of identifying a systemic, a product, a foundation, an institutional practice, a system that has a signifier and signified element of the structural term that makes any other voice or any other competing presence to be relegated. And even it becomes a way by which any way of attacking that logocentric element, like, for example, religion, the dominance of religion over certain kinds of people, or the dominance of a particular idea of philosophy, as always grounded, fascism, for example, even liberalism, the idea of democracy as going around the world, as being a form of system that the globe wants to recognize as governance. And if any form of a governance goes apart from it, is going to be attacked by the world system of today, is a form of logocentrism. Because even democratic practice, conception of the world, so far it now becomes a normality. Something that breaking it is breaking something that translates to a taboo. You are talking about a logocentric element. By the way, a number of thinkers are postulating things against grand narratives of logocentrism that can even come in form of liberalism. Like I've talked about democracy today, or talk about some legal frameworks in the West, in the United States, for example. when George Floyd was killed by those white policemen, the kind of things that were coming up within the United States and even all over the world against systemic institutional racism that has been taken for granted as the system, just like the police system in the United States, that is racialized and to a very great extent, even patriarchal, can be seen as the continuity of logocentrism. So, deconstruction, according to Jacques Derrida, began to engage this. And it starts with Ferdinand de Saussure by identifying his formulation of structuralism as even a form of différance. Now, when the deconstructive practitioner is talking about deconstructing a text, for example, or an idea, the person is engaging two things. Number one, just like Jacques Derrida did, he identified that when we talk about the relationship of signifier to the signified, you are already foregrounding difference, just like Saussure did. Like the moment you say this, you are by extension not saying this. That is different. So difference is part of what we look for in deconstruction. But when you are doing a deconstructive criticism, we go beyond difference because difference itself can be very, very totalizing. If you say the black is different from the white, then you are creating a binary opposition. The problem actually is the problem of fixity, which can even happen within the discussion of difference, just like Ferdinand Saussure definitely did. But now, when Derrida comes further, he argues that even the signified is just a conceptualization of the thing being referred to. It is not the thing in itself. By extension, the signified does not give us the actual representation of what it is trying to refer to. It is just a copy of what is referred to. In other words, the signifier differs the signified by not actually being able to represent the signified. It only represents it. It cannot represent it. By extension, the only neutral ground by which the construction can operate is within the realm of différance. The fact that, well, when we are doing a particular criticism, we know that there is a differential relation, but then there is no emetic, there is no fixed difference. There is no fixed way of talking about difference. Difference is everywhere, and difference is heterogeneous. The way I look at difference in Nigeria, for example, in terms of racial politics, might not exactly be the way another black person in the United States will be engaging with racial, aggression, simply because of a number of things. Number one, that person's history in the United States might be very much close to something I cannot understand, that I only observe through the media here. And difference can also embed a number of discourses like, gender, sexuality, time, history, and so many other things like that. So when we talk about the construction, we are talking about something very large. We are talking about something that brings about a way in which we see breakages, continual fissures that are very, very important for us to look at in their own fragmented compartment. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. We have not finished. We are still going to wrap this up in the next production. We want to exhaust this deconstruction and then look at another critique that comes looking at post-structuralism in another way, and then we try to look at, strengths, differences. Please make sure you subscribe to this channel, share it, like it, get it around. Thank you very much.